The grave was fresh enough that the dirt still smelled like rain. Caleb Morrow packed it down with the flat of his shovel, one slow strike at a time, the way a man pounds a fence post when he does not trust himself to stop. The wind coming off the bighorns carried the scent of sage and horses and something colder than snow. He did not cry. He had done his crying in the wagon on the way here, silent and shaking, one hand still on Sarah's cooling wrist because he could not bring himself to let go until the doctor pried his fingers loose. He drove the shovel upright into the mound and stood there a long time with his hat in his hand. The little pine cross he had carved that morning read only her name and the year, 1884, because there had not been room for the truth of her. Sarah Morrow, 29 years old. Better than any of it deserved. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words did not sound like his own. "I told you I'd build you a porch this summer. I meant to." He mounted the buckskin gelding, and he rode. He did not go back to the cabin. He did not sell it. He did not pack her things. He simply turned the horse west into country he did not know and let it carry him. The neighbors watching from the ridge said later that they had never seen a man leave a place so completely. Not angry, not weeping, just gone, the way smoke goes when a fire is beaten out. That was the first year. There were 6 more after it. Before we go further, settle in wherever you are tonight. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We love knowing who's out there riding with us in the dark. Caleb Morrow spent those years the way a wounded animal spends them, moving. He worked cattle drives out of Cheyenne. He broke horses in the Dakotas when the wind chewed the skin off his hands. He rode shotgun on a stage line through the Bitterroots one whole winter, sleeping upright with a rifle across his knees. He spoke when spoken to. He drank when he could not sleep. He never wrote a letter home because there was no home, and he never took off the plain gold band on his left hand because taking it off would have meant admitting she was gone, and he had not agreed to that yet. Not in any part of himself that mattered. The men who rode with him said he was the kind of quiet that made you check your own conscience. Not mean, not cold, just so far inside himself that you felt loud standing next to him. They stopped asking about the ring after a while. They stopped asking about anything. By the summer of 1890, he was a 34-year-old man who looked 45. His hair had gone iron at the temples. His eyes had the flat, tired look of a man who had seen more country than company. He was riding south through the Powder River Basin, alone, with a string of 2 horses and a half-broken pack mule, headed nowhere in particular because nowhere was the only place he could still stand to be. He was crossing a shallow creek at midday when he heard the cry. It was thin. It was high. It was the kind of sound that at first he mistook for a hawk or a rabbit in a snare. But it kept coming, and it did not stop, and something in the pitch of it turned his blood to something colder than water. He drew rein. He listened. The buckskin's ears swiveled forward. A child, somewhere off in the willow brake to his left. A child crying the way children cry when they have already given up on being heard and are only crying because their body will not let them stop. Caleb sat his horse for a long moment. He was a man who had spent 7 years not stopping for anything. He had ridden past burning wagons. He had ridden past a woman waving from a doorway in a fever year, and he had not looked back because he could not afford to. He knew what happened to men who stopped. He knew what it cost. The cry came again. Weaker. He swung down. He found her under a fallen cottonwood, wedged into the hollow where the root ball had torn out of the earth. A girl, maybe 7 years old, maybe less. She was thin enough that her age was hard to read. Her hair was matted the color of dead grass. Her dress had been calico once, blue flowers on white, and now it was the color of dust and old blood. One of her feet was bare. The other still had a shoe on it, though the sole had come away from the leather. She saw him and stopped crying at once, the way a wild thing goes still when the shadow of the hawk passes over. Her eyes were enormous and gray and utterly without hope. "Easy," he said. "Easy now. I'm not going to hurt you." She did not answer. She only watched him. He crouched down slow, hat in his hand, the way he would approach a foal that had never known a human touch. "What's your name, honey?" Her lips moved. No sound came out. "You hurt." She shook her head. Then, after a moment, she nodded. She did not seem to know which was true. He looked past her into the willow brake, and he saw what he had been afraid he would see. A wagon, tipped on its side, maybe 40 yards off, one wheel still turning slow in the wind. A man's boots sticking out from under the canvas. "Flies." He looked away. "How long you been here, sweetheart?" She held up 3 fingers. Then, uncertain, 4. 3 days. Maybe 4. Alone in that hollow with what was left of her people 20 steps away. Caleb Morrow, who had not wept in 7 years, felt something crack down the center of him that he had thought was long past cracking. He took off his coat, and he wrapped her in it, and he lifted her out of the hollow, and she weighed almost nothing at all. He camped that night in a stand of pine 2 miles from where he had found her. He did not bury the family in the wagon. He said the words over them from the ridge, and he covered what he could with canvas, and he marked the place with a cairn of stones so someone from the army post at Fort McKinney could come back for them. It was not enough. It was what he had. The girl would not eat the biscuit. She would not drink the coffee. She sat by the fire with his coat still wrapped around her and watched him the way a barn cat watches a stranger, without blinking, without moving. When he laid out his bedroll and told her it was hers, she did not touch it. She curled up in the dirt at the edge of the fire like an animal that had never known a bed. He sat up with her all night. He did not sleep. Toward morning she spoke for the first time. Her voice was so small he almost missed it. Mama said someone would come. Caleb looked at her across the coals. His throat closed. Someone did, he said. She thought about that a long moment. Then she closed her eyes, and for the first time in 4 days, she slept. The nearest town was a place called Buffalo, half a day's ride south. He carried her in front of him on the buckskin. She had told him, in pieces, over the course of the morning, that her name was Ellie, that her father's name had been Thomas Rhodes, that they had been going to her uncle in Sheridan, that the men who came had ridden horses with a curled brand she drew in the dust with her finger, and Caleb had looked at that brand a long time without speaking, because he knew it. The Broken H. A man named Ansel Hooker's outfit. A cattle king out of the North Country who had spent the last 10 years buying, burning, and beating small homesteaders off any patch of grass he decided he wanted. Caleb had heard the stories in a dozen saloons. He had not believed the worst of them. He believed them now. He rode into Buffalo with the child in his arms, and the whole street stopped to look. A woman came off the boardwalk in front of the mercantile with her hand over her mouth. The blacksmith set down his hammer. The sheriff, a lean man named Cobb with a limp that came from a Confederate ball at Shiloh, stepped out of his office and did not speak until Caleb had reined in. Where'd you find her? Powder River. 3 days north. Wagon on its side. Family under the canvas. Broken H riders, by her account. Cobb's face did nothing. That was its own answer. Bring her inside. There was a widow in Buffalo named Ruth Ellery, who took in children the county could not place. She was 31 years old, and she had lost a husband to the winter of '87 and a baby to the same fever 3 weeks later, and she had built a life since then out of quiet work and other people's grief. She met Caleb at her door with flour on her hands and no expression on her face at all until she saw the child. Then something moved behind her eyes that Caleb recognized because he had spent 7 years trying not to feel it himself. Bring her in, Ruth said. Kitchen's warm. Ellie would not let go of Caleb's shirt. It's all right, honey, he said. He tried to pry her small fingers loose and could not. He looked up at Ruth, helpless. Ruth Ellery crouched down until her face was level with the child's. She did not smile. She did not coo. She simply looked at Ellie the way one survivor looks at another. I lost mine too, she said quietly. You can stay as long as you need. Ellie's fingers loosened. Caleb Morrow was standing in a stranger's kitchen with a child's grip fading from his sleeve, and he felt something he had not felt in 7 years, which was the sensation of being present in his own life. He did not know what to do with it. He set his hat down on the table because he did not know what else to do with his hands. He meant to ride out at dawn. He stayed 3 days, then a week, then a month. He told himself it was because of the girl. She had nightmares. She would wake screaming, and only 2 voices in the house could bring her back, Ruth's and his. He told himself it was because Sheriff Cobb had asked him to give a statement, and then another, and then to ride out with a deputy to show them the wagon. He told himself he would leave once the marshal came down from Cheyenne. He told himself a great many things, and none of them was the true one. The true one was this. On the 4th morning, Ruth Ellery had set a cup of coffee in front of him without asking, and she had said, "You've got the look of a man who buried somebody." And he had opened his mouth to say something short and closed, the way he always did, and instead he had said, her name was Sarah. And Ruth had nodded once, and she had not asked another question. She had only refilled his cup. He had not said Sarah's name aloud in 7 years. He had not known he was allowed to. If you were in his place, standing in that kitchen after 7 years of running, with a child sleeping upstairs and a woman across the table who understood loss the way he did, would you have stayed? Would you have trusted it? I want to know what you would have done. The trouble came, as trouble always does in that country, on a still evening when the wind had died and the sky was the color of a bruise. 3 men rode into Buffalo from the north on horses branded with a curled H, and they tied up outside the saloon, and the middle one, a broad man with a face like a cured ham, walked across the street to the sheriff's office and put a piece of paper down on Cobb's desk. "Bill of sale," he said. "The Rhodes place on the Powder. My employer bought it 2 months back. There's a survivor, we hear. Little girl. Family arrangement puts her in Mr. Hooker's care as guardian, seeing as her uncle in Sheridan turned out to be no uncle at all." Sheriff Cobb read the paper without touching it. "This paper's forged. That would be for a court to decide. Mr. Hooker send you?" "Mr. Hooker sent me to bring the girl home." Caleb Morrow was in the doorway before Cobb could answer. He had crossed the street from the boarding house without hurrying, and he was standing there now with his coat open and his gun belt showing. And the broad man turned and looked at him, and something in his face went careful. "You'd be the drifter," the broad man said. "I would. Girl's not your business." "She is now." The broad man smiled without any part of his eyes participating. "Mr. Hooker has 40 men. You have a horse and a bad haircut. Do the arithmetic." "I've done it," Caleb said. "Ride out." They rode out. But they were not gone. Everyone in the office knew it. Cobb folded the forged paper in half and then in half again, and he said, without looking up, "He'll come himself now." "Yes," said Caleb. "You know what that means." "I know." Ansel Hooker came 4 days later with 12 riders and a lawyer in a black coat. And he came at sundown because he was the kind of man who liked to arrive with the light behind him. He was smaller than his reputation, 50-something. Silver hair, silver mustache, a soft voice that had never had to be raised because everyone in 3 counties had learned to lean in and listen. He stopped his horse in front of Ruth Ellery's house, and he did not dismount. "Mrs. Ellery," he called, "I'd like the child, please. I've got the paperwork. I've got the men. And I've got the patience of a saint, but not a martyr. Bring her out." Ruth stood on the porch with a shotgun broken across her forearm. She did not raise it. She did not need to. "She's not coming out, Mr. Hooker." Ansel Hooker sighed the sigh of a man greatly put upon by the world's foolishness. He looked past her to where Caleb Morrow had come around the side of the house, quiet as weather, and was standing in the yard with his hands loose at his sides. "You," Hooker said. "You're the one who found her." "I am." "You have any idea who I am?" "I have a fair idea." "Then step aside." Caleb Morrow did not step aside. What he did instead was speak, in a voice so low that Hooker's riders had to still their horses to hear him. "7 years ago I buried my wife," he said. "She died of a fever a doctor could have stopped if we'd had the money for a doctor. I rode away from her grave, and I did not stop for anything or anyone from that day to this. I rode past folks who needed helping. I told myself I had nothing left to give. Then I found a child under a cottonwood on the Powder, and I stopped. And I understood something I have been a long time understanding, Mr. Hooker. I stopped because my wife spent her whole short life stopping for people. And every mile I rode without stopping was a mile I rode away from her. Not toward peace. Away from her." He took 1 step forward. The nearest broken H rider's hand drifted toward his hip, and then, thinking better of it, drifted back. "That girl is not going with you," Caleb said. "Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Not ever. And if you try to take her, I will spend whatever's left of my life making sure you regret it in specific and creative ways. Do you understand me, sir? If this story is reaching you tonight, if you have ever loved someone you could not save, or found something worth saving when you thought you had nothing left, you are exactly who this story was written for. A like and a subscribe tells us to keep telling them." Ansel Hooker looked at Caleb Morrow a long time. He was not a man used to being spoken to in that voice. He was calculating, the way men like him always calculate, whether the cost of the thing in front of him was worth the price of taking it. He signaled his men. 2 of them stepped down. What happened next was over in less than a minute, and Caleb never afterward could describe it in order. Sheriff Cobb stepped around the side of Ruth's smokehouse with a rifle already at his shoulder, because Cobb had been posted there since noon. The blacksmith came out of the alley across the street with a scattergun. "Old Doc Pardee, who had ridden with Sherman and had not aimed a weapon at a man in 25 years, was on the roof of the mercantile with a sharps that could drop a buffalo at 400 yards. The town of Buffalo, which had lived under Hooker's shadow for a decade, had decided quietly and all at once that this was the night it stopped. Hooker's 12 riders looked at the 6 barrels they had not counted on, and they did the arithmetic themselves, and they set their hands very carefully on their saddle horns. Ansel Hooker did not. Ansel Hooker went for the pistol under his coat because men like Ansel Hooker cannot imagine losing, and it is that failure of imagination, in the end, that undoes them. Caleb Morrow drew and fired once. The bullet took Hooker through the shoulder of his gun arm and knocked him backward off his horse into the dust of Ruth Ellery's yard, and the pistol he had never quite gotten free of the coat spun off into the weeds. He lay there with his silver hair in the dirt and his soft voice for once entirely gone, and he looked up at the sky above Buffalo with the expression of a man who had discovered, too late, that the world had rules after all. The lawyer in the black coat surrendered the papers on the spot. 2 of the 12 riders turned state's evidence within the week. It came out at the trial in Cheyenne that Ansel Hooker had ordered the killing of the Rhodes family himself, along with 4 other families over 6 years, all for parcels of grass he had already decided were his. He was hanged in the spring of 1891 on a gray morning with nobody in attendance but the marshal, the priest, and the 2 women whose husbands he had killed. His holdings were broken up and sold at auction, and the money went into a fund administered by Sheriff Cobb for the widows and orphans of the Powder River country. Ellie Rhodes received the deed to her father's homestead on her 18th birthday, along with a letter from the governor of Wyoming apologizing on behalf of a territory that had failed her family. But that was all later. That night, after the Broken H riders had ridden away in the dark with their boss tied across his saddle and a deputy riding escort, Caleb Morrow sat on the top step of Ruth Ellery's porch with his hat in his hands. Ruth sat down beside him. Neither spoke for a long time. Upstairs, through the open window, they could hear Ellie stirring in her sleep and then settling. "I don't know how to be a father," Caleb said finally. It was the truest thing he had said in 7 years. Ruth was quiet a moment. "I don't know how to be a mother," she said. "I had 6 weeks of practice, and then I didn't anymore. Maybe we can figure it out slow." He looked at her. She was looking straight ahead at the dark yard, and her hands were folded in her lap, and she was not asking for anything. "Ruth," he said. "Yes. I've got a wedding ring on. I don't think I can take it off yet." "I wasn't asking you to." He nodded. He looked down at his hands. After a while, without planning to, he said, "Sarah would have liked you." Ruth Ellery closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were wet, but her voice when it came was steady. "I would have liked her too." The wind came up out of the north and carried the smell of sage across the porch. Somewhere down the street a dog barked once and stopped. Caleb Morrow, who had ridden alone for 7 years, sat on a porch he did not own next to a woman he had known 1 month, and he understood, without needing to say it aloud, that he had come to the end of the riding. He took the gold band off his left hand slow, and he did not put it away. He slipped it onto a leather thong he wore around his neck, next to a small carved wooden horse that Ellie had given him 3 nights before, and he tucked them both under his shirt where they would lie against his heart. Sarah had spent her whole short life stopping for people. He figured he could carry her the rest of the way, instead of running from her. 2 years later, on a spring evening the color of a peach, a girl of 9 came running up the path from the creek with her braids flying and her boots muddy, calling for her mother in the kitchen and her father in the barn. Ruth Morrow, 6 months along and moving careful, came out onto the porch with a wooden spoon in her hand and told her to wash before supper. Caleb came out of the barn wiping his hands on a rag, and Ellie hit him at a full run, and he caught her under the arms and spun her once, the way he had every evening for 2 years, because it was the deal they had made without speaking of it, that he would be there in the yard at sundown, and she would come running, and neither of them would ever again have to wonder if the other had gone. He set her down. She tore for the pump. Ruth watched from the porch, one hand resting light on the swell of her belly, and she smiled at him across the yard, the small private smile she saved for him alone. Caleb Morrow stood in the yard of a house he had built with his own hands, on a piece of Wyoming grass he had bought fair, under a sky going soft the way skies do when a day has decided to end well. He touched the leather thong at his throat once, out of habit, and he thought, as he did every evening at this hour, that the dead are not left behind when we finally stop running. They are carried. That is the whole of it. You carry them into whatever comes next, and you let them see it, and the seeing is how they rest. He walked toward the porch where his wife was waiting, and the light on the grass behind him was the color of everything Sarah had ever wanted for him, and it went on for as far as the eye could see. Next, we'll tell the story of a young widow who inherited a failing ranch and one letter from a man she'd never met. A letter that arrived 20 years after it was written, from a soldier who claimed her father had saved his life and left him a debt he had spent his whole life trying to repay. Until then, ride safe, friends. We'll see you at the fire.